there like an event going on or something?
Hi everyone, welcome, good afternoon. This is just to let you know, we'll be waiting a minute or two for people to find their way here. I will stop the screen share poster and signal once we're ready to start.
I apparently have lost my Wi-Fi right now. I'm not sure why, but
Oh, no.
if y'all can hear me, I'm on my phone, so it should
Okay.
be fine.
Okay, you sound and look amazing right now. We'll be sure to monitor if you're cutting in and
It's
out. Just
very
join us
sweet.
as you
Thank
can.
you. Okay. It'll just be shaky while I figure out what to do with my phone.
That's okay, just one more glitch in our Zoom apocalypse simulation that we're living in. But anyway, so hello everyone, good afternoon. We are so grateful that you could join us today for the final spring quarter installation of the Arts and Justice Research Workshop Series entitled Modes of Embodiment, Race, Praxis, and Environmental Justice. As more people are making their way here, I would invite you all, if comfortable, to share in the chat where you're Zooming from, so we might get a sense of how geographically spread out we may be as we're in community with one another for the next hour and a half. My name is Christine. I'm Zooming in from the Stanford campus, where I am a first-year English PhD student studying ostensibly post-colonial literature and the environmental humanities. On behalf of the Arts and Justice team, again, I would like to thank you all and welcome everyone. To begin, I would like to acknowledge that Stanford occupies the ancestral, traditional, and unceded territories of the Muwekma Ohlone tribe, who are the successors of the historic and sovereign Varana Band of Alameda County. This land continues to be of great importance to the Ohlone people, as it has been since time immemorial, and Stanford continues to benefit from its use and occupation. As we orient ourselves, I hope we can carry forward both the responsibilities and accountabilities of being on unceded Indigenous land into our conversation today, but also into our practices and work beyond. On behalf of the Arts and Justice team, I would like to thank our sponsors who made this workshop possible at the Stanford Humanities Center. I would also like to thank our co-sponsors, the core working group, Critical Orientations to Race and Ethnicity, the Stanford Arts Institute, the Center for Comparative Studies in Race and Ethnicity, the CCSRE, and TAPS, the Theater and Performance Studies Department at Stanford. As you can tell, we love acronyms here. This event, though, just to contextualize a little bit about why I feel it's so urgent and why I'm so excited, as many of us probably would have seen this morning, a report was made by the World Meteorological Organization this morning that concluded there was a 40% chance that we could edge over the threshold of the Paris Climate Agreement in the next 5 years. The rapidity and scale of anthropogenic climate change renders practices of environmental justice and correspondingly environmental humanities scholarship more urgent than ever, and our panel occupies that very juncture today. Centering themes of temporality, corporeality, and race in the age of the Anthropocene, our panelists come together to discuss the unmaking of bodies, corporeal archives, and sounding praxes of environmental justice, particularly as they intersect with and inform one another. We hope that our incredible collection of panelists and the ensuing conversation today will demonstrate just how critical and generative this interdisciplinary work can be for both scholarship and for activism. To give a brief layout of the event, So the event will consist of 15 to 20-minute presentations from our 3 speakers, followed by a moderated conversation and concluded with an open Q&A. Please feel free at any point throughout the presentations and throughout the conversation to post questions in the chat or to raise your electronic hand during the Q&A portion of the event. We would also welcome videos on if possible and if comfortable. To start, though, I would like to introduce our moderator, who is both an extremely incisive scholar and a caring and generous mentor to many students here at Stanford, including me. So it is my sincere privilege and pleasure to introduce Carlos Nugent, who is a literary, cultural, and environmental historian of the US-Mexico borderlands, and more broadly, the hemispheric Americas. He received his PhD in English from Yale University in 2020, and his excellent article, quote, Lost Archives, Lost Lands, Rereading New Mexico's Imagined Environments, was the recipient of the Norman Forster Prize for the Best Article of the Year in American Literature. Currently a Mellon Fellow in English at Stanford University, he will be joining the faculty of Vanderbilt University next year, and it's my opinion that they'll be very, very lucky to have him. And so with that, I'll hand it over to Carlos.
Yeah, thanks a lot for the warm introduction, Christine. I could say equally nice things about you, but it's my task at the moment to introduce Nadia Chana, who will be presenting with the intriguing title, Singing with Rivers. And I think it's worth noting here at the outset that in addition to being an assistant professor of ethnomusicology at UW-Madison, Nadia is also the founder of the Bicycle Opera Project, which I hope we'll have occasion to hear more about, which is a small opera company that takes contemporary Canadian opera to Canadians by bicycle. So she is helping us see multiple possibilities for this interdisciplinary field, the environmental humanities. So I hope you'll join me in listening to Singing with Rivers.
Thank you so much. Thanks so much, Carlos and Anna and Christine and everyone involved in putting this panel together. Thank you for the invitation to present conversationally, to talk about our process and to present something kind of unpolished and in progress. I'm a settler of South Asian descent who was born and raised in Amiskwetsi-Waskahigan, or Edmonton, Alberta. And I'm tuning in from Teejop, whose newer name is Madison, Wisconsin. These are the ancestral lands of the Ho-Chunk people who were forced to cede this territory in 1832. I say this out loud because I don't want to lose sight of this broader context and history of the lands and people who make my life here possible. I name my background partly because it gestures towards my histories and contexts, only gestures towards them, but also because I have learned that folks can hear me say the name of my birthplace in Cree, look at me as a non-white person and assume that I'm Indigenous. So I'm trying to clear that up front. And in making this acknowledgement of where I'm situated and sort of how I got here, I set the intention of trying, even if I don't know how, and I don't quite, to move and to speak from a place of knowing that I am on stolen Ho-Chunk land. There are roughly 3 sections here, and they are sort of in progress. I'm going to share the framework of my nascent book, and then there will be a short invitation to muse on a hypothetical question about singing 2 rivers. Actually, I played with that preposition quite a bit. And then there will be an autoethnographic section that hopefully will make sense in light of what I've said my book is about. So we'll see. My work as an ethnomusicologist centers listening. While much music scholarship has approached listening as a unidirectional act, so a listening subject apprehends a sound object and somehow understands it, my work, and I follow musicologists like Nina Eidsheim, Dylan Robinson, and Suzanne Cusick. My work argues for the relationality of listening, which is something co-constituted by listener and sounding body. So listeners bring their listening histories with them, and with us, and our biases with us, and our practices of listening with us. We're taught formally or informally how to listen. And as Nina Eidsheim argues, listening is also a multisensorial act. To give an example, this can involve, say, a brown person singing opera, and people watching that and then deciding that they hear racial difference in the sound, which voice scientists would say isn't really possible. Although sometimes you can hear linguistic traces, like which languages are a person used to speaking. Which languages is a person used to speaking? Listening is also an act that is emplaced, in this case on Indigenous land during a time of ecological crisis. I am working towards a project called The Invisible We: Listening, Voice, and Ethnography on Indigenous Land. What I call the invisible we is a normative set of techniques, assumptions, and methods that I argue structure relationships between addressers and addressees. Specifically, the invisible we has to do with authorial voices, settler or non-Indigenous publics, concert-going audiences, and sometimes ethnographers. It appears alongside the modes of address conventional to Euro-Western literature and materializes in ways of listening cultivated by Western art music's ideal listener. Critically, it is practice and enculturation that make an invisible we. Though the project draws on ethnographic fieldwork in Alberta and California at concerts, healing walks, water ceremonies, and other events organized mostly by Indigenous leaders, the project then does not represent Indigenous musics. Instead, it engages with critical Indigenous theory to consider settlers' oft unseen and unacknowledged role in the relational act of listening. I ask, how is settler listening shaped by specific histories and forgettings? What practices of listening do settlers of color, a heterogeneous group often too visible to become part of an invisible we, bring to Indigenous land? Finally, how can practices of listening across racial difference or species difference affect deeply embodied change? By tracking moments where the invisible we materializes, my book is trying to unearth relationships among dominant listening practices, settler colonialism, racialization, and ecological crisis. Simultaneously, this research attempts to rehabilitate, heal, and transform, these are huge claims, so I don't know if I can do this invisible we, a cultural myopia currently harmful even to white settlers, as it imagines and enacts new relationships across difference. This project and its focus on the invisible we become clearer via a narrative about the origins of this research project, which began in the summer of 2014 at the Tar Sands Healing Walk in northern Alberta. I'm gonna share my screen here. Is this visible? Could I just get a thumbs up? Okay, great, thank you. Occupying a Greece-sized chunk of the province and constituting the third largest oil reserve in the world, the Alberta tar sands are notoriously energy and labor intensive to process. The bitumen, or heavy oil, must be separated from its admixture with sand, water, and clay, a process that releases more carbon dioxide than conventional oil processing, and significantly for neighboring communities, requires much more water. It was the 5 Indigenous communities most affected by tar sands development that organized the Tar Sands Healing Walk. Led by the drumbeat and song of a group of Dene musicians, hundreds of people, both Indigenous and settler, walked 16 kilometers around a tailings pond, a lake of toxic wastewater and sludge left over from processing tar sands. So I'm gonna show you a really messy video that I took while running backwards. The sound of air cannons punctuating the singing served as a somber reminder. So that's a tailings pond there. The birds that land on tailings ponds face instant death. Still, the healing walk was not a protest, but an act of healing for the people, the land, and all of the relationships among them. More importantly, the healing walk was shaped by the belief that gathering people to look at the tailings ponds, to smell the chemical scent of the tap water from the nearest town, to pray, to heal relationships among themselves, and above all, to sing to land and water did something. Here, all acts were recognized as material rather than merely aesthetic. If, as Michael Michalak has argued, quote, the environmental crisis is more than a problem for scientists, it is a problem of narrative ontology and epistemology, end quote. Considering seriously the practice of singing to rivers offered great promise. However, when I first started to describe my project to settlers, even if I framed it as being about ecological crisis and human relationships with a more than human world, I began to notice that they often could not see or imagine themselves in the project, even when explicitly mentioned. It was as if they disappeared. If pressed for a geographical location and which people where, I would say that I wanted to think about Indigenous, settler, and non-human relationships at the tar sands in northern Alberta. It was as if I had never said settler. Many settlers I spoke with wanted to hear exclusively about the Cree and Dene people, about their traditions, their music, their practices. They seemed to be waiting for a story that would transport them. This persistent floating away, this becoming invisible of my settler interlocutors prevented my original project from becoming legible. It became about Cree and Dene activists at the tar sands, something I wanted to avoid. Not only since settlers writing about without invitation about, in quotes, Indigenous peoples can so easily reinscribe extractive colonial practices, but also because I wanted settlers to be able to see ourselves in this project. This book then has become more explicitly about settler publics, settler bodies, methods, listening practices, and relationships with Indigenous peoples and land during a time of ecological crisis. So I'm hoping that this big thing that I've laid out translates somehow to what I read next. What happens when you sing to a river? And what happens when you sing to a river repeatedly? I don't know how the river reacts, but if you sing to a river every day, you might not throw your gum wrapper into it. You might feel closer to the river. You might become curious to see what the river looked and sounded like on any particular day. You might want to get to know the river better, finding yourself looking up all the cities the river runs through. You would likely notice with more subtlety the river's changes. You would probably listen to the river for responses to your singing. You might listen to the river as you sang. Your songs might change depending on the river's mood. You might even start listening to people differently, to humans differently. You might start to notice things on the walk or the drive to the river. You might go to the river to be comforted. You may feel a kinship with other beings who gather at the river. You may take other people to be healed by the river. You may start to think of that river more and more often when you turn on your tap. You may be particularly concerned with what happens upstream and what happens downstream. You may start to wonder about other rivers, and other people, humans, may start to wonder about you and your river singing. Maybe singing to rivers becomes a metaphor. Maybe it also begins to mean walking to the river, fishing from the river, strewing flowers into the river, and greeting the tree by the river. September 29th, 2016. At the North Saskatchewan River in Amiskwetsi, Waskahigan, I finally walked down to the river to sing to it. Everything smelled like autumn. There were bare trees, many trees with yellow leaves, some with green. There was something so poignant about these colors against the sharp, cold sky. The landscape was almost painful in its beauty, the river too. I crossed the concrete bridge, took the first path on the left, and came down onto the first sandbank. The sand was quite fresh. There was only one set of old footprints. The rest were new and wet. When I knelt down beside the water, I found an abundance of seagull feathers in the river, and this made me a bit reluctant to touch the river. I did anyway. The water was very clear, and the stones sang beneath the clear water. I began to sing. I sang the song again and again. I trailed my hand in the river. Should I touch the river while singing? I listened for the river, but it was quite quiet. What I did hear was the cawing of seagulls on the opposite bank. I alternated between watching the river flow and feeling as if it were flowing with my singing, or that my singing was helping it flow, or that it was helping my singing flow, and looking straight down at the clearish water right in front of me. A river can be looked at in so many different ways. I found 3 very striking and beautiful stones. They were multicolored, one jade and red, one split down a line of red and pink, and the last black and yellow. I picked them up and then put them back into the water along with a stone from my pocket. Did they form an altar beneath the water? October 6th, 2016. Today I also went to the river. It had snowed very heavily last night, and it felt like a spring day this afternoon because the sun was out and the snow had started to melt. Such a beautiful landscape. I wore my green sorels and they made my right heel bleed, that small pain becoming a high-pitched hum in my awareness. I was also taking off and putting on layers, taking them off, putting them on, taking them off, putting them on, attending to the high-pitched hum. I didn't go straight down to the river this time, although I found myself greeting it in my head by singing continuously. I crossed the bridge, past the turnoff to my usual visiting spot, and instead took a parallel path. The path was small and snowy and muddy, and I was surprised to see both footprints and bicycle tracks on it. Snow, I guess, shows you with more precision than mud who has been there and when. Surprises. There were lots of green things poking through the snow and some red berries and yellow leaves, very slippery. A few meters from the turn were many felled trees crossing the path, beaver territory. Or maybe that coupled with the fact that there had been heavy snow. At any rate, that's the place that Mom and I saw that big, beautiful beaver some months ago, diving and gliding. Soon after I made that observation, I passed under a large tree arch, and it felt very ceremonious. It's funny how attuned you become to these ceremonious moments when you're outside and thinking in that way. It's almost as if that passing through initiates a new thought or a new way of being or a new atmosphere, the way stepping through a doorway into a new room would. I was looking for a way to get onto that sandbank or bar. I took a left turn at one point and walked through some untouched snow, ending up at that place where a friend and I had sat and sung to the river a while back. I sang a bit and held some balled up snow in my warm hands until it melted. The melting of the snow became a time marker in a way. It signaled that it was time for me to keep walking. So many things can become signs in this way. Making up ceremonies, are they ceremonies though? And trying to communicate with the river relies so much on things like that. A little while later, I stopped again, sang, again made a snowball. This time, instead of letting it melt, I threw the snowball into the river. And then I stayed until I couldn't see the snowball anymore, floating away. After that, I walked back to the bridge quickly. Before crossing the bridge, though, I went down to the river via my usual path. I was surprised to see there were no human footprints, only paw prints. Coyotes? Dogs? After having watched the water lap so clearly and gently the sand, I spread my palms and rested them on top of the water, slowly pulling them away. And then I walked back home, faster, because my job was done. We do not sing to a river unmediated, no matter how much we wish that we did. And we intertwine these practices with other memories and practices. In January 2017, 2 months after my mother's death, I was about to move to Berkeley. My partner and I were loading up my mom's old Corolla to drive there. "Don't you want to say goodbye to the river?" John asked. We walked down the hill outside my childhood home. The sun was shining and everything was snowy and glittering. After I had sung through the North Saskatchewan and said goodbye, John surprised me with a ring that he had made. In a way, because of that, the river flows through my relationship with him. The river will also flow here long after I have died, long after everyone I know is gone. So this section that came after what I said my book project was, is trying to do a number of things that I'm not sure it does. I think it can read as very, there are so many histories and practices I could have gone into there, and this is very surface level in a way. I'm hoping, though, that it is an entry point for people who are floating away to kind of see themselves in that. I'm also like, it reads as being like very heteronormative, all these things. So I think I need to suture that in a little bit better. But I'm trying to find a way, I think I'm trying to model settler ways of beginning to cultivate some kind of relationship with a river. So thank you so much for listening.
Well, I felt like I was not only listening, but also touching the various textures of the frozen and unfrozen water, and looking at the signs of beaver and coyote. It was a very synesthetic form of scholarship. So thank you. I think we're in for more scholarly synesthesia in the presentation of Elaine Gann, a gential Oriza unmaking or making and unmaking bodies, bits, and bombs. And to give you a bit of context, Elaine is a co-editor of the really excellent anthology Arts of Living on a Damaged Planet. And she explores some of these arts as a professor and director of the Multi-Species World Building Lab at NYU. So let's hear from Elaine Gann.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for being here. Thank you, Carlos. Thank you, Nadia. Thank you, Christine, Anna, and Pavitra. Thank you for the invitation. I'm really honored to be here. Okay, and again, thank you, everyone, for coming. I'm going to share my screen and okay, and hope this somehow works because I'm using a couple of different screens. Well, first of all, I changed my title, apologies. I simplified it and just called it Oriza Temporalities. But I'm going to talk about a flowering grass that most of you here know as rice or Oriza. In my practice, like Nadia, actually, I map relations that make rice possible. I'm interested in how rice comes to exist as plant, machine, and data in different sites. And in response to the very big prompt of Anna and Christine, I thought I'd offer 3 ways of looking at rice as embodiments of relational processes. So you'll see bodies as verbs. So I've organized kind of these kind of 3 sections as verbs. And again, they're bodies as verbs. So verb 1, planting better futures. What you're seeing on the screen are actually just snapshots.
I'm listening to an arts and humanities.
Hello? Oh, okay, right. Sorry, I heard someone speak. So All right, so what you're looking at is actually snapshots from different field sites. I've been, going around following rice kind of around the world, in the Philippines, Norway, California, Mekong, that's in Vietnam and Laos. So kind of really going around and paying attention to differences in rice. So this first verb is sort of about that. So planting seeds in soil, seeding rice fields so that crops might grow and perhaps flower and flourish, is an act of imagining and making a claim for an ongoing or future relation. No human farmer plants without some expectation of harvest. Practices of planting imagine better days to come because they've done so in the past. But what counts as a better future? For purveyors of industrialized agriculture, better means more yield and higher grain productivity. For farmers otherwise, better means a capacity to live together, to sustain relations, lasting relations with kin and land. There's a vast spectrum of what defines a better future, and these materialize or take form as hundreds of thousands of rice cultivars, ranging from indigenous varieties and foraged wild grains to colonial breeds, state-certified seeds, and genetically modified hybrids. Each cultivar or variety of rice embodies many histories, many cycles of coordination, experimentation, and adaptation in order to survive in different futures. Each cultivar depends on a particular assemblage of relations. Now, the practices of planting and the assemblages are quite different depending on where you are. For example, in much of Asia and Africa, planting rice is done by hand. Farmers' bodies bend downward, knee-deep in water, feet in mud, hands move back and forth, picking seeds and laying them down swiftly, one at a time, in flooded fields. In Northern California, planting is done from the air. These are single-engine, GPS-guided airplanes that swoop noisily across fields, dropping bleach-soaked seeds from 30 feet above the ground, covering thousands of hectares in a matter of days. In Australia, tractors and machines direct drill the seeds into dry ground. In Japan, robotic seeders plant seedlings while simultaneously discharging fertilizers and insecticides, a kind of all-in-one cyborg operation. There are many, many more. I think if you go and search on YouTube, you'll find tons and tons of videos, just endlessly entertaining. But I think they're useful in seeing bodies as real practices, right? And that it's very difficult to make out the outline of a human very often. So my point is that there is a very vast spectrum of cultivars and the kinds of cultivators they require. Some human, some machine, some molecular, some microbial, some multinational. Eventually, cultivators select the varieties that they want to see again, some for subsistence, but some for profit, some out of delight or respect for elders. Rice is what anthropologist Anne-Marie Moll might call a body multiple. Rice cultivars are made and remade through relations that they are in the process of making and remaking. Thus, a plurality of bodies mingle season after season, coordinating in response to many rhythms and cycles. Here's the second verb. The second verb is sorting, sorting racialized seeds. So early in my research, I was struck by one of the ways in which rice research institutes organize their seed collections. The largest rice research institute is called IRRI, I-R-R-I, or International Rice Research Institute, and it's located in the Philippines. It was founded by the Rockefeller and Ford Foundations in the 1960s. So rice here is classified into four categories. First is modern or elite or improved hybrids. Second is traditional or native land races. Third is weedy relatives. And the fourth is wild ancestors. But it's that distinct, right? So the distinctions represent degrees and hierarchies of human intervention. The first, moderns and hybrids are bred intensively to have highly productive traits, for example, high yields, fast growth, disease resistance, and predictable growth patterns in types of locations. So not specific locations, but types. The second, traditional land races are cultivated by local farmers and indigenous groups, highly variable and improvisational, linked to specific places and collective ways of life. The third, weeds are noxious, matter out of place, and always destined for rapid elimination. The fourth, wild varieties fall outside of the domesticated sphere. They're valuable for genetic diversity and adaptation beyond human control and management. So these classifications have consequences. And I was struck by the temporal orientations that seem to run alongside the racialization of seeds. Moderns are associated with Western progress and the future. Moderns are high-yielding seeds that fight world hunger and ensure universal peace based on usually American standards. Traditional land races belong to a vanishing past, heirlooms of ancestral tastes, aromas, and reified cultural and colored non-white heritage. Weeds and wilds are incommensurable, biding their untimely times in seed banks and genetic labs until one trait or another might be reintroduced to supercharge the future of moderns and hybrids. So I call these racialized futures and pasts that are played out through seed classification, and it undergirds research at institutes. And these institutes now produce 75% or more of the rice varieties that are grown today, and probably most of what we all eat today. So why does making this connection matter? Because equating moderns with better futures rationalizes the assemblages that go along with them. That means it rationalizes chemical fertilizers and pesticides, dams, machines, and irrigation canals. It rationalizes the erosion of genetic diversity, human and non-human. It rationalizes the dispossession of non-white, non-moderns. So equating moderns with better futures rationalizes harm. These are disruptions to major cycles through which all life in this epoch has become possible. To name a few, it's nitrogen, water, carbon, photosynthesis. And disruption is not confined to a single timeline of cause and effect. So when relations are broken, new ones emerge. Disruptions or breakdowns give way to novel material discursive formations. Some are disastrous, like algal blooms, viruses, insects, fungal blasts, and bacterial blight that now dominate many or most crop fields. But others that might emerge may be supportive of living otherwise. And that raises a big question, right? Which ones are allowed to survive or not? I'm trying to say that not all disruption is good or bad, and not all emergence is good or bad, but they warrant close attention. So meanwhile, the traditional land races, or among the traditional land races in this research institute, are among them are 300 varieties cultivated by farmers in the Ifugao mountain provinces of northern Philippines. So the seeds were gathered by anthropologists working with Ifugao collaborators from 1963 to 1985 and cataloged for conservation at IRRI. These traditional seeds coexist, they're contemporary with modern seeds, but traditionals are framed in a very different way. The Ifugao rice terraces from where these seeds come from are listed as a UNESCO World Heritage Site, valued for aesthetic beauty and harmony from ancient civilizations. IRRI fields are part of a global technoscientific consortium for agricultural innovation, signifying human mastery over the future. So in short, traditionals are beautiful and ancient, while moderns are productive and they look to the future. And so I'm trying to, in my writing, draw that out. we need to pay attention to these maneuvers because they lock seeds in their cultivators into particular kind of inescapable places and positions. So I wanted to just take a moment to just show you some diagrams to just visualize what I've just talked about. So this is from rice production manuals. It's an arrow of time that tracks the growth of seed to harvested grain. So research institutes are tasked with building what's called a food secure future. And diagrams like this, like production diagrams, are essential. Crop diagrams always begin with a lone seed, what you're seeing on the left, and then it undergoes 3 growth phases: vegetative, reproductive, and ripening, and these are tracked to the day. One point in time matters, and that's harvest, right? It's all the way on the end on the right. This figure eliminates relations, and each stage is just a step towards achieving yield, right? So this is what's put out in crop production manuals. The next 3 slides I'm going to show you are ways of troubling that. So these are 3 that I've made. These are diagrams, or almost like counter diagrams, to open up and unpack and unfold this, singular arrow of time. This one is a diagram that visualizes relations that change over one planting season in a rice field in Laos. So if you remember that single arrow of time, this is the arrow of time kind of opened up and showing all the relations that are, disappeared or erased when we only look at one seed. So you'll see the same. Here's the vegetative phase, reproductive phase, and then the ripening phase, and then harvest. Here's another, I'm going to show you also another diagram that's trying to visualize historical and ecological change that's happening at different scales. On the left is the local cycling. I'm not sure if you're seeing my cursor, but if hopefully you are. On the left, you're seeing farmers. These are farmers who are using, green manure and animals and plants. So there's this local cycling of nitrogen that then enlarges to start using nitrogen imports from Peru and Chile. That again shifts, and so there's another diagram on the right to show kind of an expanded nitrogen cycle, and that's the synthesis of nitrogen and industrialization of ammonia during the 1920s. That's coming out of Germany and then the US. So these are diagrams to show how that arrow of time actually can be embedded within larger historical and ecological change. This third is one of the older ones that I did at the beginning of this rice project. And you'll see 2 horizontal strips. The top strip shows the traditional varieties that I just talked about from the Ifugao provinces in the Philippines, and the assemblages that go along with their cultivation at different times of year. And then below that, the bottom horizontal strip is modern varieties and the assemblages that go along with that. Trying to say again that sorting rice seeds means also engaging with all the assemblages that come with one or the other. Okay, I won't get into all the temporalities, but I hope you see the different calendars and the different seasonalities that are kind of getting mixed around here. Okay, so we're gonna shift to the third verb, and that's entangling. This is entangling War and Peace. So again, another shift in temporal register. So July 16, 1945 is the date of the first nuclear bomb test, codenamed Trinity, in New Mexico as part of the Manhattan Project. This is the mushroom cloud 10 seconds after detonation. Science studies scholar Joseph Masco marks this date as the beginning of what he calls the age of fallout. There were 215 detonations carried out in the US between 1945 and 1962. Masco writes that, quote, "We are living in the unintended environmental aftermath of cumulative industrial projects, a process that remakes bodies and atmospheres on a planetary scale and does so in ways that we have yet to fully account for, let alone begin to govern," end quote. So critical point that Masco makes in naming the age of fallout is that while these detonations radically changed the planet, they simultaneously gave rise to Earth system sciences, or new tools for knowledge, scientific tools we now use to assess planetary phenomena. That we even have a conception of the Earth as a planetary system is an effect. It's one of many effects of fallout. This is a diagram that I pulled from Masco's essay. She's stole it. So Masco notes that fallout was used to study global wind patterns, and that's what you're seeing here. Right? They're kind of mushroom clouds, and then what's borne by the wind around the world. So researchers track the global distribution of strontium-90, demonstrating that the radioactivity absorbed by soil doesn't stay put and doesn't just disappear. It eventually makes its way into the bodies of plants, animals, and eventually humans. I'm going to try to connect this to rice. So along with Earth system science also came a new kind of agriculture. And I'm interested in how tools for war, or what makes 250 nuclear detonations seem rational, also enabled a new kind of crop science and breeding, or what passes as food and agriculture today. In the 1950s, the US government under Eisenhower launched a program called Atoms for Peace. It's essentially a media propaganda campaign to displace public fears of nuclear disaster with promises of peace and abundance through nuclear reactors and atomic energy. One weedy offshoot of Atoms for Peace was, it's called radiation-induced mutation in crop plants. So here's the connection to California rice. So California rice is farmed in the Central Valley. That's about 150 miles from where most of you are. In the early 1900s, mining, cattle ranches, and wheat farming were replaced by specialty crops. One of them was rice. So you're looking at the rice experiment station at Biggs, which is north of Sacramento. This rice station was opened in 1912, and up until the 1950s, rice yields were pretty average. There were 2 to 3 tons per hectare, if you know your rice numbers or grain numbers. With the introduction of synthetic nitrogen and fertilizers and pesticides, so that diagram you saw previously, yields were expected to rise and rise dramatically. But California rice plants, or CalRose, so the brand name for California rice is CalRose. Those plants grew very tall. So this meant that when, this is CalRose, this meant that when fertilizers were applied, the plants produced a greater number of plumper grains, and eventually they just toppled over from the increased weight. So the problem is called lodging, and that made harvesting with machines very difficult, right? So imagine a large plow making its way through heaps of long stalks lying on the ground. You know, it's just easier to cut upright, short stalks. So when California breeders heard about modern seeds and high yields at Erie in the Philippines, they attempted to cross those varieties with California varieties that you're seeing on the screen. But Erie seeds came from a totally different evolutionary line. They were adapted to tropical, not temperate climates like California, so they couldn't crossbreed, basically. So this posed a problem. How could shortness be incorporated into the bodies of CalRose plants to make them more, you know, kind of machine-like? or more friendly to machines. So in 1971, a young geneticist at the USDA named J. Neil Rutger began experimenting with this technique called radiation-induced mutation breeding. So by exposing Calrose seeds to gamma rays from a cobalt-60 source, Rutger succeeded in scrambling their genetic composition. And this is what happens. Rutger produced a Calrose mutation that grew short and sturdy stalks, a new semi-dwarf or short variety that was now more amenable to fertilizers and machines. The irradiated mutant, and that's what it's called, right? So quote, irradiated mutant was no longer tall and pliant, and it was now named Calrose 76 to commemorate the year of its release. So since Calrose 76, all California varieties are bred for shortness. They're also bred for other traits that are taken very seriously because they affect the crop's profitability. But shortness in particular is very interesting because it derives from across the Pacific with the Erie varieties, which themselves derive from the imposition of American and German logics, materialities, and industrial nitrogen schemes onto tropical Southeast Asian bodies, human and non-human. In this sense, shortness is the inscription of 19th and 20th century biogeopolitics and racial capitalism onto the physical bodies of 21st century crop plants. So shortness is an entanglement of war and peace, matter and discourse that challenges us to think about scales or figurations or temporalities in deeper, more critical and more creative ways. Okay, I'll end there. I'm going to close here. So these are the three processes for considering modes of embodiment that I wanted to offer you. One is planting, sorting, and third is entangling. Okay, thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Elaine. So we've heard two presentations that I take to be engaging with the relationship between human creativities and more than human materialities. So for Nadia, the creativity and creative potential of the human voice engaged with that of the river. Whereas for Elaine, the different creativities, both for better and for worse, that humans have brought to Oriza have opened different possibilities. Those linear temporalities that we see from global agribusiness, and then these counter diagrams that Elaine has used to open our eyes to the different logics of rice. So I think now with Pavitra Vasuleva, we will hear about yet another set of interplays of human creativities and more than human materialities, grounded in the company town of Baden, North Carolina, where predominantly Black workforce is engaged in the production of aluminum. And Pavitra also, like our other presenters, approaches this from various angles, having written a play about their research and engaged in various other movement practices. So I'm very excited to hear Storytelling the Lungs as Corporeal Archive. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Can you hear me? Yeah. I'm sorry, I have like two screens going. I'm having technical issues and my computer keeps cutting out, but hopefully this will work out okay. Thanks so much to Christine and Anna for inviting me into this generous space. I'm honored and excited and a little nervous, I have to admit, to be here in conversation with Carlos and Nadia and Elaine Gan. Those presentations are amazing and I'm really excited. I see a lot of resonance with my work, so I'm looking forward to the conversation. And I wanted to acknowledge that I'm on leave this past year and I'm grateful for that support from the American Association of University Women on their American Postdoctoral Fellowship. So I'm here at University of Texas, Austin, living and working on unceded indigenous lands of the Carrizo and Comecrudo, the Coahuiltecan, Caddo, Tonkawa, Comanche, the Lipan Apache, the Alabama Cushara, Kickapoo, Tigua Pueblo, and many other American Indian and indigenous peoples. We support the Miyakan Garza Band of the Coahuiltecan people in their efforts to reclaim, and it's actually coming through now. Hopefully the university will actually follow through, reclaiming ancestral remains held by the Texas Archaeological Research Laboratory here at Austin. I also remember the forced enslavement and erasure of Black folks and many others whose labor and lives have been sacrificed to create the spaces we live and work here on Turtle Island. Today I'm sharing excerpts from my book in progress. It's tentatively called Toxic Alchemy, Black Life and Death in Industrial Capitalism. Though I keep debating about changing the name, and the reason being that I begin with my ethnographic work in Baden, but I'm really thinking about aluminum production and thinking about global racial colonial capitalism through aluminum's production. And in places that looks like anti-Black racism, like in Baden, in other places it looks like settler colonialism, and in other places we would use neither of those words, though the processes are very similar. So I'm thinking about what it looks like to think about the racial and the colonial in a global sense. Black workers and their families in Baden have been engaged in a protracted struggle regarding contamination with Alcoa Inc., formerly the Aluminum Company of America, a multinational giant whose development tracks alongside and reflects 20th century US imperial history. I won't get into all of that today so much, but I hear a lot of what Elaine's saying, parallel in this other history of industrial metallurgy, and yeah, we can talk more about that. So I center my book in the Black enclave of West Baden to narrate how capital, state, and science have materially entangled Black bodies and ecologies into the very infrastructures of modernity. Today, rather than a cohesive paper, I wanted to think through and share some segments from one of the book chapters. The chapter is titled The Story of the Lungs and examines the lungs as a corporeal archive of racial colonial capitalism. I'll return to the idea of the corporeal archive, but in brief, let me give you some context for this aspect of the work. In Baden, while the aluminum plant was in operation from 1915 to 2002, occupational injuries and the ever-present threat of accidental death were simply a fact of everyday life, a reality for industrial workers the world over. However, the increasing incidence of illnesses has driven former workers and their families to wrestle with and reconsider the situation they had long accepted as simply the cost of having a job. Concerned with how occupational and environmental toxicity had impacted them and their families, Black former workers started a grassroots organization called the Concerned Citizens of West Baden Community in 2013 to organize against the racially uneven exposure to toxicity, as well as their exclusion from how the company and the town were managing the situation. And this is particularly in the aftermath of the plant shutting down. According to geographer Ruth Wilson Gilmore, racism, and anti-Black racism in particular, is by definition the premature and preventable deaths that result from the unjust conditions that shape everyday life. So I developed my research in Baden in dialogue with concerned citizens and the statewide advocacy organization, the North Carolina Environmental Justice Network. I use a methodology known as critical performance ethnography, which I'm not really going to get into today, but I'm happy to talk about it in the Q&A. The questions of health and illness, life and death have long been central to my work because it's research that's driven by community concerns. And that work has led to a long-term and ongoing collaboration with an epidemiologist. Our research, even constrained by the available data, company records and union rosters from 1980 onwards, confirmed higher mortality rates due to bladder cancer, mesothelioma, and respiratory cancer among Black workers. This is especially true of people who worked in what's known as the pot room, which is almost the kind of the hearth of aluminum smelting. It's an environment of fiery smoke, unimaginably high temperatures, and gaseous fumes. And these were the jobs for which only Black workers were hired for much of Baden's history. It was quote unquote desegregated at some point legally, but continued to be almost entirely Black workers. I'm interested here in the body as a critical node and micro level analysis of racial colonial capitalism following Caribbean feminist and science studies scholar, Vanessa Agard Jones, who describes bodies as not only a product of social relations, but an assemblage. Quote, a melding together of blood, bones, flesh, chemicals, chromosomes, cells, and spirit. In particular, I'm thinking about the lungs as a corporeal archive of the violences of racial colonial capitalism that produce unhealthy environments for some. The lungs, we might say, are the evidence of how unhealthy environments lead to premature and preventable death. And thinking about the lungs as evidence, there are two related considerations. First, the form of this evidence is embodied, which is to say, it occurs in the register of the body as a physiological and sensorial experience. And second, this evidence is interpreted not only by those experiencing the effects of toxicity in their bodies, the workers, their families, but also by biomedical practitioners and state officials who are vested with the authority to determine what knowledge counts and to what end. So my chapter, The Story of the Lungs, moves from breath to breathlessness, tracking the life course of Baden's Black workers, whose lungs toil to maintain life under the burden of aluminum production's toxic waste. I intersperse ethnographic and performative segments with histories of scientific practice and epidemiological evidence to narrate the racial mythos of modern biomedicine. And that's the racial mythos is language I'm drawing on from Sylvia Wynter, who's thinking about how as humans, we are not only biological beings, but biological and mythological beings. I can say more if we're interested in getting into that. I argue that biomedical knowledge production operates in collusion with state and capital to deny racism's material effects, belied by the bodily experience of those who cannot breathe, a symptom revealing the pathology of a racist world. So in thinking about how to consider these questions of embodiment, I've been experimenting with writing and text as artistic practice and thinking about how as scholars, we're also storytellers who construct meaning of empirical phenomena, not only for our interlocutors and students, but for general public audiences. So in writing this book, I'm thinking about how to write in a way and how to offer work that is not only critique, but a catalyst, a kind of geopoetic narrative that testifies to how life is fragmented under colonial racial capitalism and how relationality is predated upon. And I want to invite readers to question the necessity of industrial modernity in its current form. I'm building on the anti-colonial thought of Fanon and Sylvia Wynter, as well as anti-colonial modes of chronicling capitalism's injustices in the tradition of writers like Eduardo Galeano or Aimé Césaire. So the book is weaving in scholarly explication with dramatized vignettes, documentary poetics, and popular science writing. So I thought what I could do is share a couple of segments from this chapter, and I'd love to hear your feedback. This book is hopefully will happen one day. It's slow going as I'm learning how to write as I write, because I am stubborn and I decided that unless I write exactly the book I want to write, I'm not going to put it out there. So I'm trying to experiment with the style of writing, with poetry. And so I'll read you a couple of different segments so you get a sense of what I'm doing. 1, the lungs. Upon entering our bodies through the nose and the mouth, air moves through our throat into the windpipe, the channel linking our terrestrial existence to the atmospheric before entering the lungs. Our lungs are a complex, spongy system filling our chest cavities with air every breath of our lives. The lungs begin as a discernible network of tubes, the bronchi, that branch iteratively and infinitesimally into less visible pathways, the bronchioli, diffusing into a set of microscopic chambers of air. Here in the alveoli, the atmospheric, all that is not of us, is pumped into our lifeblood, flushing our body with oxygen. Here as well, the effluent from the metabolic processes of every cell in our body gathered by the capillaries is returned to the alveoli to be expunged into the atmosphere. Thus, the filtration system of the lungs that cleanses us reciprocates as well, nourishing plants in turn with carbon dioxide we exhale. We too breathe in chorus with our terrestrial vertebrate kin. As Homo sapiens, we have this in common with our kin in the clade of Tetrapoda, the chest cavities and lungs within, cycling in oxygen and releasing carbon dioxide, an involuntary process of gas exchange that occurs throughout the duration of life, presumably without effort. However, for those condemned to live and work in toxic landscapes, the capacity to breathe is progressively diminished by the deformation of the respiratory system. Toxins circulating with air, like air, part of the milieu of everyday life, come to populate the vessels and tissues of the respiratory system, impeding the free passage of air until the body can no longer sustain itself. 2. Diagnosis asbestosis. Among the complex cocktail of bodily harm that comprises Joe Black's medical history is a diagnosis of asbestosis. Asbestosis is defined as a, quote, chronic lung disease caused by inhaling asbestos fibers. Asbestos is a hardy mineral that was widely used for insulation, cementing, and tiling because of its heat and corrosion resistance. So asbestosis is a particularly societal illness that characterizes the body in question as that of a worker, likely involved in an occupational setting of an industrial nature that is poorly regulated. During our interview with Joe Black, Naima asked, and before you actually got diagnosed, what kind of symptoms were you having? Did you have some sense that something was wrong? And Naima is was my co-PI, my co-investigator. She's a longtime community organizer in North Carolina who works with the Environmental Justice Network. Did you have some sense something was wrong? Joe replied, I was just getting short of breath. Joe struggled to catch his breath, short, to retain enough air, short, to see his thought through, short, to the end of the sentence of breath. In the rhythm of his lyric speech, in the stuttered spondee of the monosyllabic short, we hear in word and body the condition of everyday life that is Joe Black's corporeal vernacular, the expression of his bodily condition. The body physicalizes and externalizes its interior condition in a myriad of performative ways. Shortness of breath makes manifest the enduring condition of stress that is a life lived without sufficient oxygen. Shortness of breath is both symptom and evidence of extensive lung damage. Fibers of asbestos inhaled through the nose travel through the respiratory pathway and accumulate in the lungs. Injured by the accumulation of asbestos, the respiratory system transforms materially. Fibroids develop, first in the bronchioli, then in the alveolar ducts, and finally in the lungs themselves, until the very texture of the pleural tissue changes into a honeycomb pattern. Like the labyrinthine walls of expanding colonial settlements, the scarred tissue of the respiratory system blocks the free passage of air as toxic molecules become interiorized in the body. A person may exhibit few symptoms as the harm caused by toxins come to cripple the respiratory organs. It can take decades for illness to manifest as something discernible, even to the one who has been harmed. In the meantime, there is shortness of breath, signaling deeper layers that lie beneath the skin. As I write, I realize the wisdom of Naima's question in asking Joe Black to reflect on his own bodily archive. Joe coughed periodically throughout the interview. His exhalations are often audible sighs. Whether sighs of momentary relief, frustration, or resignation, they emote an underlying heaviness. Blowouts in a repetitive cycle of exertion as the lungs struggle to absorb sufficient enough oxygen with each inhale and expel sufficient carbon dioxide with each exhale. Staying alive can be heavy work. Where air is denied to a body, breathing is labor. 3, and this is not actually connected with this chapter, it's more about the book as a whole. It's a poem. Who burns for the allure of aluminum? After Martin Espada, who burns for the perfection of paper. At 20, Joe Black joined the service crew at a smelting plant that produced ingots and sheets, silvery metal deposited out of an acrid bath. As they leaned over open flames, their bodies, the levers, placing carbons with precision. A hard job, a dangerous job, but if you keep everything under control, it's okay. No masks, flesh required for the allure of aluminum, tending to metal with tender care. Every day an experiment. They wanted it pure, aluminum. We had to learn how to make it on the fly. dizzy from fumes, heat, or the salt tablets he sucked on to keep constant thirst at bay. A sudden misstep, a spray of hot metal. Flight, a delicate pas de trois of heavy machinery, molten earth, and mortality. 10 years later, sitting in technical school, Joe Black recalled every drop of aluminum, enticed with the fear of death, every sleek metallic roll, another black body surviving or burning. That's it. Thank you.
Well, what an outstanding note to end these three wonderful presentations. I've been charting many interesting commonalities among these three talks, and I want to give everybody in the audience a chance to chime in with questions, so you can chat me and I'll call on you. But first, I just wanted to begin with an invitation to the three presenters that may be a bit idiosyncratic, but I hope is illuminating. So, obviously there's a common thread that all three of these scholars are experimenting at the thresholds of scholarship and the arts, that they're using poetry, visual art, song, to draw attention to phenomena that may not be intelligible through traditional scholarly methods. I think all three of them are also thinking about the body as an archive in a really interesting and important way. But I wanted to draw attention to and invite them to speak on something that seemed very apparent to me. Maybe it's not to them or to anyone else, but I think it's that all three of these presentations, in one way or another, are engaging in, but departing from and expanding on in these provocative ways, the long tradition of Marxist and post-Marxist commodity chain analysis, exemplified by a text like Sidney Mintz's Sweetness and Power. So if we're thinking about a materiality like rice or aluminum, this seemingly natural thing that exists out there as a brute non-human material, all three of these presentations are showing how these materials are produced by and productive of, for instance, race or indigeneity or other forms of difference. But it strikes me that through their creative methods and through other things that they're doing, all three of these presentations are complicating this older form of materialism and this older way of thinking about the production and consumption of commodities. So if it's not too much of an imposition, I'd like to invite you to situate yourselves in those conversations and tell me whether this isn't indeed an illuminating question or just a crazy one.
I don't know who wants to go first. I also am like scrolling between my phone screen, but I think those are absolutely, I saw that and I was actually so excited to see that all three had those resonances. I know for me, I'm trained in Marxism, perhaps most thoroughly as a geographer, but being a geographer, I also have had to teach myself often a lot of the work that comes out of Black studies, both because of actual lack of mentors and faculty in the discipline. But also, the thing that happens when you train a certain way and then you start seeing everything through those lenses. So for me, that question of materiality is actually very important. And I've within kind of geography, which intersects with many of the environmental humanities fields, I would say I both have sort of solidly been in the Marxist path for a long time, but also come from these kinds of and interested in the work in new materialities, right, has resonated with me. These questions around that see the material not only in historical materialist terms, not only in terms of production and commodification, but in the ways that they are that we might say, the agency, or it's not even only about agency, I think, because sometimes we get into that trap of thinking about agency and that can limit our conversation. But certainly the world works in ways that are more than human and more than we can capture in terms of capitalism or anti-capitalism, right? There's much more. So I think in that sense, those conversations on new materialisms, on that have conversations on embodiment, I think in performance studies, um, that pick up on and then also depart from older traditions around phenomenology and sensorial and all of that have been very much an interest for me. I'm a performance ethnographer, so for me, I've brought it in that way. But what I'm finding more and more as I write, especially as I am going to other older traditions of writing, actually, and so I mentioned Galliano and Césaire. For me, there is a, and it's not even one tradition, because in some ways, as long as there's been imperialism, capitalism, there have been anti-colonial, right, traditions that have fought against them, and some of them are text-based that we are able to actually study and think of as scholarship, and many of them aren't text-based. So I think those are my inspiration. I want to write a book that can feel like Galliano's book made me feel. Like there are books for me that I could never unsee. And I would actually even say Marx is in that tradition. There are parts of Marx's writing that I can't unsee now. I can't look at a table and not think of it in terms of fetish. I look at, and part of one of my chapters actually start with Marx's table to think about aluminum. And, for me, text can actually have that impact, even though we tend to think of text as, separate from all these other registers of embodied knowledge or sensorial knowledge. So I guess that's what I'm playing with in this book, is to see how do we write in a way that evokes those other senses. And I love Elaine, in your work, the visual is so powerful. And for me, I often think there are visuals that would accompany my book and be really powerful, but I'm not a visual artist, so it's hard for me to know what they are. But I imagine, I hope I might work with someone who can do that, because I think there is a power to that, the visual mode, right? That's different than text. And similarly with Nadia's work, I loved you're writing it, of course, but we can feel you there. We can feel you at the river, and maybe, right, it brings back for us some recollection of being at the river ourselves and having a moment. And that I love that you framed it as this kind of entry for the universal we, or the invisible kind of the settler we, to begin to recreate or transform our sense of belonging in a way that does account for and pay obeisance to the long, vast histories that exceed our moment. So yeah, I would say I very much situate myself in that realm. I'm trying to think about how to do that responsibly, and it's not the only lineage, right? There's for me, a lot of the work I read is actually in Black studies, has always been in those lineages. Much of it has not even counted and still doesn't count as scholarship, right? We still don't teach necessarily W.E.B. Du Bois, who's like quite classically a sociologist, is still not taught in sociology as one of the founding kind of sociologists, right? So there's much work in Black studies, I think, that is in that, in those various, I would say there's like a prophetic register, right? There's a certain kind of, there's manifesto kind of register. So I'm trying to bring in those forms of writing into scholarship in a way, and both to consider them scholarship, but to see how they change our ability to converse, right? With each other, with people who can't read all the footnotes, but they're still there in case, they're moved to then go pick up Césaire and read Césaire, not only as, a brilliant theorist and a philosopher, but also as a poet, and also as a playwright. So yeah, so I'm thinking about how to do that in my text. But I appreciate that question, Carlos, and drawing the links between the three.
I don't know if Nadia wants to go. I can be very brief. Of course, Sidney Mintz is such a big influence. So maybe I'll just say yes, of course, absolutely. Sidney Mintz is in there. Sugar and Power, and Caribbean plantations, of course, are very much on my mind. So I'll speak to how we diverge, maybe. And so with feminist materialism, I think what it allows us to question is how change is enacted. And this is different from what Mintz is trying to do, right? In, let's say, older materialist texts, there's almost a, there's an assumption that there's a system called capitalism, and maybe it travels and maybe it changes, but there is such a thing as capitalism, and there's the commodity chain and all that. And so I think the attention to the details of a river, the details of, different kinds of rice seeds, that there are forms that are not fetishes, but kind of materializations of real kind of, like crazy interactions, some of them intended, but many of them not. And so a kind of attention to details, but also what falls outside of human intentionality, I think is a really big thing for me. And so going out in the field and noticing what's there, has been very valuable in rethinking how these relationships work. And so capitalism is what is called into question rather than the thing to study.
Yeah, Carlos, I love this question. And I hadn't thought about it. Like when you asked it, I was like, oh, yeah. And yeah, and I think like there is, I feel like without actually being a very like confident Marxist or something like this, like I have absorbed a lot, but I think like the threads that I feel like that connect me to or connect my work to Pavitra's or Elaine's, like there is this sort of like I think for me a lot of it comes from indigenous thought, be it like critical indigenous theory or like friends and interlocutors, but I guess like there is a way in which I feel like I have been taught, like if we, so I remember at the close to the beginning of my field work, somebody saying like, talking about people like speaking with the wisdom of the stars. And I just thought that that was a metaphor. Like I was like, yeah, okay, this is a nice metaphor. And there are so many ways of thinking about, but like she was like, no, this is not a metaphor. This is like the sun is a star, and like plants need the sun for photosynthesis, and then they like release oxygen, they make oxygen and we breathe it in, and then we're speaking. Like it's like actually like a very material thing. And I feel like that has that sort of, those kinds of chains that like have something in common with like new materialism also, but like maybe come from a really different place than new materialism. I see some parallels there. Yeah.
Yeah, well, I could certainly speak to the ways that the so-called new materialism has been anticipated by various forms of thought that are often marginalized, such as you're just mentioning certain indigenous traditions of the Americas. But perhaps somebody else who's been listening in with us can ask a question. I'm sure that everybody has many things they'd like to ask the presenters.
I have a question. And I think it's because sort of, as a first year graduate student entering into the field, I'm very interested in how methodology and form inform one another. So I see all three presenters working with a combination of methodologies that are a mix of practice and a mix of theoretical background. And I see that very much coming through, like Pavitra has identified for us, the form and the generic sort of hybridity and dynamism of your work. So I'm wondering whether all of you can speak briefly to how your mixed methodologies inform the form of your work, and how you situate that vis-a-vis the wider sort of broadly conceived field known as the environmental humanities.
Yeah, thanks so much for that question, Christine. I'm really glad you asked it because it's actually something that I struggle with quite a bit, and I feel like and maybe you've also given part of the answer, which is like to really think about situating myself within the environmental humanities. But I feel like I'm trained as an ethnographer in a really like in ethnomusicology, and the demands of that are often like, if I'm doing this like musing on the river, like the questions behind like that I think ethnomusicologists would ask are these questions of the particular, which are like, well, which river and like and where and like what, like why are you singing to the river? And there is like such value in that, and it's also constraining in a way. And I don't want to also like universalize and be like, sing to the river, it's a panacea, it will like cure it'll make you do good things for ameliorating ecological crisis, right? And so that is something that I am grappling with, but I have started to think of my methodology as like a set of like constraints in a way. Like, what does it mean to like at every moment to be like, what does it mean that I'm on indigenous land? Or like, that's one of them. Or like, what does it mean to speak from a place of humility? Which actually I find like very hard. Like the claims that I want to make to seem like impressive or legitimate are they're too big in a way. And so what is it to cultivate like a voice of humility or whatever? And I feel like I just like have a list for myself. This this might be a really silly but honest way of answering the methodology question. And I think kind of like what Pavitra was saying about the book, which is like, I just have to figure out how to write this book like in the way that I want to write it. I kind of feel that way about my constraints, and I'm like playing around with them and just seeing what they shape.
Sure, I'll go. I was waiting to see if Elaine, you would go next. I don't know. I methodology. I struggle with research, so that's the number one thing I wanted to say is I always actually feel like I don't do research, and my advisor for a long time in graduate school is like, "What are you talking about?" And I was like, "But it's not real research. I don't know how to do archival research, but I don't know how to do this other thing." And with this book, I'm realizing that's just part of who I am or my process. Like the minute I learn something, for me, it opens up like these endless questions that I want to know, like, but how do I understand that thing? Like, this is fine. Okay, I got this question I can understand now, but how about all the other questions? And I think honestly, that has been my methodology, is to always be asking more questions. It is like a deeply uncomfortable way of being the world, but in some sense, right? Like well, I'm okay with it in a practice sense. So really my methodology is like, I come from various movement-based physical, spiritual practices, and that's how I approach all my work, I think. I was a dancer for much of my life. And so my research has kind of happened in that way. I'm better as a student. I'm like more comfortable as a student than I am as an expert in any sense. And so for me, a lot of the methodology stuff is just at odds with being supposed to be someone with, answers, and like, especially as I learn more, I'm supposed to have more answers, not less. And so I don't know how to wrestle with that very well. And I have done that in the context of community engaged research, which can both feel kind of frightening because there are very real stakes involved for people. There's always stakes. There's stakes if you don't talk to a single person, and we forget that. But there's stakes kind of staring in the face. When there's a community struggling, there's lawsuit, and you're like, oh my God, what do I do that's actually useful? That's often been my dilemma, my ethical dilemma, because I'm doing community engaged research and really wanting to support struggle. So I come from an organizing background, which is how I'd kind of come into research. So that kind of, I don't want to say organizing is not always utilitarian, right? But that kind of wanting to be useful to the actual grassroots struggle has always been for me a little bit at odds with also being an artist and a creative person, and kind of being like, but there's importance to like the questions we ask, or the knowledge we produce, right? And even just the kind of interactions we have. And that's the reality. Organizing is never only about like the lawsuit. It's actually about the relationships you build, the effects of that multiply, that are often not captured in victories. And if we were to go by like the victories of organizing, like it would be really depressing. Organizers tend not to focus on those because you're in it for the long haul. So for me, this is such a roundabout question because it's not really about research methodology, but it is about what drives my work. And so research methodology wise, I went to grad school. I mean, this tension you'll see it like throughout my life, but certainly throughout academic work. I went to school to study GIS as a geographer, like literally like the stereotype of a geographer. I was like, I need to learn to make maps. It's useful. I'm going to get a job. I'm pretty good with visuals. Like I'll be good, and I went there and I was like, I was in a digital analysis lab my first year. And instead of doing digital analysis, spatial analysis, I actually did a performance ethnography of my lab, which is kind of hilarious and says a lot about my, approach to research. I was like, what is it like for these, map makers to like be out in the field, experience all this, and then come back and make this totally abstracted like data science model that, it throws everything out the window. What is that experience like? So I ended up going in that, performance ethnography route, but I learned a lot about map making and counter cartography. And so all of that kind of comes back into my work, but it's messy. I don't know. I'm not a good methods person. I don't stick to methods. I tend to go like ask the question and then follow that. And so that has led to some very interesting collaborations. Like never thought I would be published in the American Journal of Industrial Medicine of all things. Like I'm not even sure I understand the article we published, like, but I know it. I know it very well. It's just that I don't do that. I don't do quantitative data science. On the other hand, this is one of the first studies that shows like race and gender disparities in aluminum smelting, which is wild because we know that industrial labor was totally divided by race. There's no question about that. But because it was like company records, like the company controls all the data. So anyway, that came out of this collaboration. An epidemiologist like watched my play. I wrote a play in my dissertation or in my research process. And they watched my play and they were like, I can do this thing. So many of the questions people are asking in your play were about health. And I was like, I can't answer them. I have none of the skill sets useful for that. So we've partnered and that's ongoing now. Now we're doing like a longer term open-ended survey kind of thing to see what people's actual concerns are that are not even in the literature. Like what are the things people mention that don't even show up when you look at aluminum smelting and health impacts? So, I don't know. I mean, methodology, I don't know. I don't have a good answer, but in this book, it's looking like a lot of experimentation, like trying to change how I think about things, like to be like, this is not about utility at all. Like that's not the way a book works. So rather, instead, I'm like turning to form a lot because that's what is important when you do creative practice, right? In certain ways, like rather than getting caught up in the content of the idea I'm trying to explain, like how do I actually say it? How do I say it in a way that registers in your body, that makes you feel it. So I'm reading a lot of documentary poetics. I'm taking classes in documentary poetics. I'm reading a lot of, yeah, like different other older traditions to learn how to write, honestly, because, you know, grad school, if you already knew how to write, grad school takes it out of you. So I'll leave you with that.
Are we okay on time? Should I say a few words?
We are here for the time that you want to give to us. And if you want to bid us goodbye, you can. But
Okay,
you
I
have
thought-
us as a captive
I thought you
audience
had
if you want.
Okay, I thought that you had a hard stop, so I wanted to respect people's time. Well, I mean, but you know, thank you for this question. I love methods question. I love methods. So I think about them all the time. So let's say it's a very kind of unsophisticated answer. It's called a follow the thing method. I learned this from feminist materialists who are my mentors. There is a brilliant essay, famous essay that most of you might know by Joe Dumit, who was a student, of course, of Donna Haraway. You know, he TA'd for Donna Haraway, and then he wrote this essay. It's called Writing the Implosion. And the main, you know, he's trying to combine Deleuze and Haraway in this essay. So it's a little bit loopy, but it's amazing. But Haraway's approach is basically, you could start with anything in front of you. It could be a pen, it could be a glass. And if you follow it, you will find new ways of looking at the world. And that's been a, you know, kind of a primary method for me. More formally, it's ethnography and media practice and archival research. But behind those big words, you know, literary analysis, all that. Behind all of that, I really love thinking of method as really simply following the thing. If you follow the thing, and in my case, it was rice, rice becomes something else, and so do I. And so I think that the goal of the research was also, I think for me, to allow rice to tell me about the world. And, you know, of course, this is in the work of Isabel Stengers, Karen Barad, and many of the people who I read, Anne-Marie Moll. So, you know, how do you, on the one hand, follow the thing? On the other hand, how do you become attuned to the thing and let it, you know, show you different, I guess, different processes and different agencies in the world. And, you know, throughout all this, you know, following the rice, there's no single rice, right? It's a plant, it's machine and data. And I would not have gotten to that if I didn't follow the thing. I'm also really interested in, I mean, a question I'm really thinking about right now and probably will write one day when I have the time is media as method. And that's also because I work, you know, across a variety of media. And I don't mean medium as in print or video or audio. I mean media as in interactivity or sensing, right? Just different ways that we embody or embed ourselves in various kinds of processes where we kind of disintegrate very often and become a very different kind of body. So I'm interested in media in that sense. Yeah, I think there are some really, really interesting media folks right now who are thinking about body as immersions. You know, how do you break apart this relationship between subject and object? So the reason why I structured the presentation as verbs is I'm interested in, the reason why I'm super interested in method is it's a verb, right? Where subject and object emerge out of the method rather than there being a researcher that goes out into a field and writes about a thing. You're becoming something else in the process as well. Thank you for that. I love this. We could talk for like hours about method. There's also a really incredible collection. It's an edited collection by Andrea Ballestero and Britt Ross Winterek that's coming out in June. So yeah, a few days from now. It's called Experiments in Ethnography, or maybe Experiments with Ethnography. That's, you know, trying to think about this as well. And so I'm so sorry to be like shameless about plugs. So I do have an essay in it called Diagrams. But it's really thinking about methods and protocols and how do you actually teach students to do this kind of work? How do you work across collaborations and interdisciplinarity? You know, interdisciplinarity is super hard. So yeah, it's a great collection that's coming out soon.
Thank you for that. I'm afraid we've already exploited your time too much. I know you offered to answer that, but I don't want to pull any further. But thank you all for joining, for presenting your wonderful papers that you claim to be a work in progress, but already so generative. And to Carlos for moderating, and Christine for really thinking to bring all of us together in this room. Thank you also to Carol, who's here, who works for the Stanford Humanities Center and really runs all of the workshops and keeps this to be an active side of Stanford's community. So thank you all for gathering, and I hope you enjoy your weekend.